Is it possible for white people to be discriminated against because they are the majority and discrimination involves power? Is it possible?
Absolutely. It is unequivocally possible. It happens all the time. This actually happens not only in specific instances, but this happens in a systemic way on our most elite college campuses. And I would also say that this is happening not just in education, but in the workplace.
You could definitely discriminate against white folks in general. There's a sense of minorities have power over the word of mouth, it seems. You can't really say anything against black folks or against a minority because you're white. You don't have that power in that regard to say certain things. There's a control over the tongue. We've seen this on college campuses throughout the last couple of years. Now, granted, First Amendment, you can say whatever the heck you want to, but there's I'll say a social understanding, which not saying it's right, but there's a social understanding that white folks should not and cannot talk in certain realms.
Well, is it justified, though? Because if there has been disparity and if there has been discrimination, if there have been minorities that have been excluded for years and years and years and years, is this the way to start to bring some balance and diversity back to those universities and workplaces?
Absolutely not. Affirmative action has been going on for over 50 years. So this has been happening for a long time. And even now, we've actually seen that it's gotten worse in the sense that race relations are so poisonous. And many people on college campuses actually feel like because of all of this that's happening, they feel like they're being pitted against each other.
Do I think affirmative action was a good thing? Yes, but I think it's one of those things that went too far. Originally, there was a huge segregation problem, and campuses were not letting in the brightest because of, segregation. And it wasn't just limited to African Americans, and some other ethnicities were barred from getting into certain universities because of segregation. So what affirmative action did is it forced college campuses to have to take in students. At the time, I think it was a great thing. I think the problem now is that it went from forcing colleges to let in the best and brightest to being a checkbox quota system. I have to have this many students of this ethnicity from this background in my university. The merit for them being there might not necessarily be there. You're just checking off a box in order to get funding and everything else, which I think that's where we've gone, and I'm not for that. But the original intended purpose of affirmative action, I would say at the time it was needed. Similarly with other stuff like child support. At the time, it was needed. Is it something that people exploit? Yes.
I would very respectfully disagree. I certainly don't think that white people are disadvantaged in college admissions. In fact, I would say it is the exact opposite, which is why there are policies and practices in place now to try to alleviate the historical burden. It's like if you ever played Monopoly before, right? Imagine you have a person who's playing Monopoly and they get to go around multiple times, right? And then halfway through the game, someone gets to enter into the game. And then because they get a turn, right, then the accusation is, well, somehow that game is unfair. The kind of accusation, what we would say is reverse racism, we really just view it as what we call race lighting. Race lighting is what happens when gaslighting is racial. And essentially, if you look historically, colleges and universities have prioritized admissions for students who are white. Why is that? When you admit a student, it's oftentimes based upon your grades, high school grades, and your test scores, ACT and SAT, which are being phased out due to COVID-19. But if you think about it, the SAT and ACT have historically measured access to resources, the neighborhood that you grow up in. It is not a measure of a student's drive, a student's motivation.
The SAT and the ACT aren't meant to measure drive. They're meant to measure knowledge. And I'll say knowledge in the sense of how much you can regurgitate. I do not see these tests as a marker for intelligence. There are plenty of people who have drive, but they have very poor grades because that's not where they strive and they do well in. That's, once again, not an ethnic issue. That's not a race issue.
It is really a measure of their access. And ultimately, we know that when things measure access, they really measure white privilege.
It's not white privilege. It's a wealth privilege. People who are in wealthier neighborhoods who can afford higher education, can afford to send their children to camps, they're going to do a lot better than a kid who is growing up in a low-income neighborhood where the schools are failing in all regards, where the teachers are absolutely trash. That has nothing to do with ethnicity.
Candace, are we compromising standards
Yes.
if we do that because we haven't fixed the problem down the line?
That's correct. It is the policies are harmful also to the people that they purport to help. And we have all of the evidence there to look at. When you artificially place a Black American into a school in which they do not belong based on their knowledge, doesn't mean that they go on to get A's. In fact, there was a Black adjunct professor, you guys have definitely heard of him, Dr. Thomas Sowell, who was teaching at Cornell University, and he found that the majority of the Black American students that were there were on academic probation. Now, these students were some of the smartest in the nation, but because they were artificially placed amongst their peers at Cornell University, they were failing on academic probation. These policies have never helped Black Americans. It's just basically policies that are put in place to make people feel good, right? I feel like I'm doing something when in fact I'm actually creating harm. You either know the answers or you don't.
I've seen a study when it comes to college academic probation when it comes to college students. And one of the things that they were saying is the majority of people who get into college will enter, but a lot of them will not graduate. In order for them to get in, they had to have had the grades. But a lot of that comes down to mindset and thinking that you belong, I feel like. Putting people in a position to where, once again, this also comes from where you're at, too. If you are looking at low-income students who were excelling at really crappy schools, if I put you in an environment like, let's say, a private school or a private institution, you're going to find out that a lot of the kids that are in your realm are exceeding what you've been doing. Out of all of my siblings, we were all very educated and very smart. But when we ended up going to another school where we had teachers that were challenging us, we were getting bad grades. And my mom was like, well, how is this possible? And she started to realize, like, yo, you were getting good grades because when it comes to education, the teachers don't teach to the excellers. And they also don't teach to the people who are low. They teach to the middle. When you're not in the middle and you're excelling, you're going to get bored. You're also going to get lazy too. So when you end up in an environment where like now you are in the middle, you are expected to excel, you're either going to sink or swim. And most people sink because they're not used to that type of pressure. And you feel intimidated by the people around you.
When you say, hey, we have Black students at a particular school who aren't performing at that school as well, the immediate assumption that you're making is, well, maybe it's because they're not smart enough, they're not good enough, or they don't belong here. Whereas it could be about the experience that they're having at that institution. Professors who believe that they're not intelligent enough, that they don't have the capability to do the work, that they see them as criminals, deviants, dangerous, up to no good, or they talk about them with the they statements. They're lazy, they don't care, they don't really belong here. They're only here for the financial aid.
I'm giving you actual facts.
No,
right?
I'm giving you actual facts based upon extensive
say, well, maybe they
research
just
that's
don't
been
feel
done.
good. That's not the case. I mean, I went to university. I did not feel good, right? I didn't pull the best grades in high school, probably got into a better university than I should have gotten into based on my performance in high school. It wasn't because of my feelings. It's because I wasn't focused on it. And that, we're talking about a cultural problem, what's going on back at home, as was in my circumstance. And none of that is because of institutionalized policy. It almost seems like you guys refuse to accept that, Black students aren't performing well. You feel like you have to have this burden of responsibility when in fact, if you actually wanted to help, you would look at the facts, re-examine the fact that it's not helping anybody. It's not helping Black Americans to artificially place them into universities, and you'd make effective change.
But you're making the assumption that Black students are academically inferior, and they're not.
No,
They're
you
some of
are
our
actually.
most brilliant students
that's
that we
the
have.
basic. No. That you are making the assumption that they are inferior.
You
It
just
is
said
why
that they
you
don't
want
belong there.
policies. I'm talking about the students that are based on the policies that you are defending right now, saying that we should have these policies that let them into these universities, not based on their skill set, but based on the color of their skin. So you are assuming that they are inferior.
Hey, fair point. All right, I'm going to stop there, though. Kinfolk, you let me know what you think in the comment section below about this whole conversation. But as always, Kinfolk, you know I love you, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.